This is Through My Eyes, the Ruby Bridges story, and it is a memoir that she wrote herself. Make sure that if you are listening to the read aloud, that you're following along in your own copy of the book while you listen. Okay, it starts out with a foreword from Harry Belafonte. Dear reader, most of my life has been spent working in the world of civil rights and human rights. In that world are many stories of loss, many stories of victory, and many stories that deal with the courage of those who stand up against injustice. Nothing can be more moving than watching a small black child climbing the steps to her elementary school that historically and legally did not welcome her presence. Ruby Bridges has been called by her country to perform an act of profound bravery, to become the black child in an all-white school. By this simple act of courage, Ruby moved the hearts and opened the minds of millions of people. Her story was and is an inspiration. You'll find this book comforting, informative, and worthy of your attention. Okay, starting on the first page. When I was 6 years old, the civil rights movement came knocking at the door. It was 1960 and history pushed in and swept me up in a whirlwind. At the time, I knew little about the racial fears and hatred in Louisiana, where I was growing up. Young children never knew about racism at the start. It's we adults who teach it. In spite of the after effects of the whirlwind, I feel privileged now to have been a part of the civil rights struggle. The 1950s and 60s were important decades. Negroes, as African Americans were known then, dared at last to demand equal treatment as American citizens. School integration was only one part of the struggle, but an absolutely essential part. In 1954, coincidentally the year I was born, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered the end of the separate but equal education for African American children. Because of her race, Linda Brown was not allowed to attend her local elementary school. All 9 justices of the Supreme Court agreed that Linda had a legal right to go to that school, but for years afterward, the court looked the other way when states in the South ignored its order. Black children in states like Louisiana and Mississippi continued to attend all black public schools. White children went to separate and usually better schools. By 1957, less than 2% of Southern schools had been integrated. That year, 9 black high school students enrolled in a white school in Little Rock, Arkansas. The white segregationists in Arkansas were furious. President Dwight D. Eisenhower ordered federal troops, soldiers with rifles and machine guns mounted on military jeeps, to protect the Little Rock 9 in their school. Even after the events in Little Rock, Louisiana continued to ignore its African American children. However, the civil rights movement was growing stronger. A federal court gave the city a deadline for school integration, September 1960. I don't remember everything about that school year, but there are events and feelings I will never forget. In writing this book, I recall how integration looked to me then, when I was 6 and limited to my own small world. However, as an adult, I wanted to fill in some of the blanks about what was a serious racial crisis in the American South. I have tried to give you the bigger picture through my eyes. Now we're on the section that says, Born in the Deep South. I came into this world as a healthy 7-pound baby, my parents' first child, on September 8, 1954. From the small hospital in Tylertown, Mississippi, where I was born, my mother took me home to the farm where my parents lived with my father's family. My father's parents were sharecroppers who worked the land under the broiling Mississippi sun. Sharecroppers didn't own the land they farmed. They paid rent to the landowner in whatever crops they raised and struggled to survive on what was left. My mother's parents were Mississippi sharecroppers too. When I was older, I loved visiting the farm where they lived. After my family moved to New Orleans, I went back and spent every summer of my childhood on that vegetable and dairy farm. I wasn't the only child on the farm. My mother came from a big family and many cousins went to help out in the summer. My parents stayed in New Orleans to work. My grandfather tended the dairy herd while my grandmother, Amy, took charge of the 2 acres of vegetables. You can grow a lot of vegetables on 2 acres. All summer long, my grandmother organized my cousins and me into work shifts, heading into the fields to pick beans or cucumbers, or helping in the kitchen with the cooking and canning. Canning meant preserving food so that every family would have vegetables through the winter. That was how the grown-ups fed us children. Those hot summers were good ones. When I fell into bed at night, I was tired, yet happier than any other time in my life. I took the summers for granted then, the way kids do, but I now know they were a gift. Best of all was being with my grandmother and being one of her favorites. Her love and attention made me feel very special then, and even more so now. A new home. My family moved to the old seaport city of New Orleans in 1958 when I was 4. On the block where I lived, everyone was black. White families lived on the next block, but at the time it seemed as if they were a world apart. A lot of black people, like my parents, had left farms in Louisiana or Mississippi to make a better living in the city. In New Orleans, we rented the front part of a large house on France Street. It was a big rooming house with other families living in apartments upstairs and in the back. Our part of the house had only 2 bedrooms, so my younger brothers and my sister and I shared a room. In 1960, when I started first grade, there were 4 Bridges children, but eventually there were 8 of us piling into bunk beds in that bedroom. The best part of the house was the kitchen, where we ate all of our meals. My mother did a lot of cooking. We had big Southern breakfasts with grits, bacon and eggs, and homemade biscuits. At night, my mother sometimes cooked New Orleans-style food, like red beans and rice or fried catfish and shrimp. For dessert, she sometimes made one of my favorites, banana pudding or sweet potato pie. The weather in New Orleans never gets too cold, so we played outside most of the year. We stayed close to home and never left the block. Most afternoons, my mother wanted to keep an eye on my brothers and sister, but I managed to play jacks and jump rope with my friends and climb the huge China ball tree by the house. On the weekends, somebody was always starting up a softball game in the lot next door. My world in those days was comfortable and safe. My parents didn't have much education, and it took everything they had to keep the family going. My father worked as a service station attendant. My mother sometimes took night jobs, like cleaning rooms in one of the city's hotels. I remember my mother taking a job making caskets. She would tell stories about how she and the other workers would get into the caskets to see if they were comfortable and how they would take naps in the caskets during their breaks. My brothers and sister and I thought those stories were fascinating. My mother brought us up to believe that God is always there to protect us. She taught us there is a power that we can pray to anytime, any place. At the same time, my mother didn't allow any nonsense from her children. She was strict. We all had chores and we were expected to carry them out. When she told us to do something, we were supposed to say, "Yes, ma'am," and not too much else about it. And that's where we're going to end today.